So we're back with part 2 of a 3-part series in response to Drew, or Genetically Modified Skeptic, and his video that was dedicated to not only refuting the fine-tuning and teleological arguments, but also to show that Frank Turek is dishonest, will use dishonesty to maintain his position, as he claims Christian Apologists do. In the last video, we talked about the misunderstandings that Drew had about Frank Turek's response to the puddle analogy, which is an objection to the fine-tuning argument. But in this video, we're going to be talking about some more of Drew's misunderstandings and how that led him to claim victory just a tad too early. Now, I don't really want to waste any more time, so let's just get right into it. You guys ready? Then let's go!
If you're walking along the beach and you see in the sand, John loves Mary, you don't go, gee, the waves made that. Or the crabs came out of the water and made that message in the sand, right? You know immediately that that message must be the product of a mind.
I can't believe that people are still unironically using this analogy. This material is ancient, and it's just a permutation of William Paley's centuries-old watchmaker analogy. In short, this argument is flawed because it's a false analogy. It implies that because two things, the letters in the sand and DNA, share one quality, complexity, that they must share another quality, design. This is logically fallacious. They don't have to share another quality.
Alright, so right off the bat, we see an issue. When Drew talks about how we shouldn't conflate complexity with intentional design, he's right. But he's wrong to think that that's what Turek is doing here, or that's what proponents of intelligent design claim, as he argues later. Drew's thinking that Turek is using Paley's watchmaker argument, but he isn't. Even if Paley's argument was simply that a watch is complex, so therefore it's designed, that's not the same reasoning that Turek used in the clip. He didn't refer to anything being only complex and therefore designed, but instead he argued for there being messages in DNA, and that messages come from minds. Design and complexity can be inferred from what he says, but it's important to get Turek's argument right. Turek was speaking of a message, not simply something just being complex, which makes a lot of what we're going to see from Drew's video somewhat of a straw man. But let's keep going so we can get deeper into it.
What Turek doesn't state here is that while letters in the sand have been proven to be products of human creation, DNA has been shown to grow and change naturally without any observed creator.
Okay, not to be redundant, and it's possible that I'm missing something here, but Turek's argument was about a message inside of DNA, which isn't synonymous with DNA just growing and changing, and we'll get to that later. But leaving that aside, I think the heart of the issue is the initial information being placed in the system of DNA, going back to when the first strand of DNA ever existed. This seems to me to be the crux of the argument, rather than DNA's ability to replicate and change. Now, I want to remind people of what I said in the last video. I'm not arguing for intelligent design or any other theistic argument here, as that's not my intent for this video. My goal in this video is only to show the misunderstandings involved in Drew's assessment. So let's keep it moving.
In all our prior experience, messages always come from minds.
Messages are a product of the mind, but not in the way Turek thinks. Things which are perceived as messages don't require an intelligent creator, they only require an intelligent interpreter. An event, a sound, a physical object does not have to be intended as a message to be perceived as one. More on that later.
Okay, stop right there. Did you notice that shift in Drew's argument? Turek said that messages are always the product of a mind, and Drew starts off by saying that yes, messages are a product of the mind, but not in the way that Turek thinks. And then he goes on to argue against perceived messages as if they were the same thing as messages. But messages are not the same thing as perceived messages. We'll come back to that, but I just want you to keep that in mind as we keep going.
Now that's just a few letters long, or a couple of words long. But imagine a message 3.2 billion letters long in every one of our cells. If John loves Mary requires a message, a messenger, a mind, then a software program 3.2 billion letters long also seems to require a mind, a great mind, to create.
Again, this argument from complexity is fallacious. I've done all I need to do to refute it in this video already.
Yeah, not quite. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, happy feet.
But seriously, if you want to hear it taken down in even greater depth, go watch the Rationality Rules video I've linked in the description.
And look, atheists can get rid of the argument from information in DNA by simply answering this question. What natural laws can create messages?
This is really easy, actually. Again, messages require only an interpreter to exist. If I gave an example of a perceived message existing but then being shown to be caused by natural forces, would that satisfy this question? It would, right?
Nope, it sure wouldn't, and here's why. Notice again how he sets out to debunk the validity of a message by shifting over to the debunking of perceived messages, which in actuality aren't messages at all. Trying to debunk a message by pointing to perceived messages is like pointing to Monopoly money to debunk the money in my wallet. You can't tell me the money in my wallet is fake because all the 3-year-olds at your child's preschool thought it was real money. You need to debunk the thing in itself. Similarly, if you want to say that DNA's message is not really a message but only the perception of a message, then you'll need to debunk that head on. So let's keep it moving.
Okay, then I'll cite multiple examples. In 1976, NASA's Viking 1 spacecraft orbited Mars and took a photo of its surface, which revealed a rock structure that appeared just like a humanoid face. NASA released the photo to the public, and many saw it as an intelligently created structure meant to convey some artistic meaning or a signal to humans on behalf of Martians. When Mars Global Surveyor photographed the same structure again in 1998 with a much better camera, the formation was shown to be a natural formation with no features of a face. The appearance of a face was the result of shadowing and a low-resolution camera. Nature communicated a message without intent.
Okay, first off, nature didn't communicate anything, all right? And to be clear, what he's saying is that people misunderstood the face as being a message from aliens. But his broader argument seems to be that because people were wrong about the face on Mars and similar events, then we can't trust their perceptions of messages, and therefore people are wrong about DNA having a message. Or maybe he's making the more modest claim that it doesn't mean that we're wrong about DNA, but instead we can't trust our minds when it comes to the perception of messages in DNA, since we've been wrong about other alleged messages in the past. Well, first off, that sort of sweeping statement just won't do. We'll have to take each claim on a case-by-case basis, and I think Drew would agree with me here. Just because we were wrong about certain things in the past doesn't mean that we're wrong now about something that's entirely different. But here's where it gets worse. The comparison loses the little bit of steam it has once you realize that DNA is actually giving meaningful messages because it is communicating something. Namely, it's given the blueprint and instructions for the organisms that will eventually develop. Notice here that this isn't anyone imposing a message on DNA's information system, like what happened with his Mars example. With Mars, people saw the illusion of the message being communicated, but the more that we were able to inspect, we quickly realized that it wasn't. So Mars wasn't actually communicating a message at all. But with DNA, we know from science that DNA is actually communicating something, and it sends real information that is received and used. Notice here how we didn't look at DNA and just impose this onto the DNA, but by studying DNA in more detail is what led us to know that DNA is actually communicating messages. This is the opposite of a message without function or relevance, as it was in the case of Mars. Now, the next two examples he uses suffer from the same issues, and I wouldn't have very much more to add, so rather than us sitting through them, I'll skip them for now so I don't bore you to death. If you don't believe me, feel free to watch the video as the link is in the description, and start around the 9:30 mark. But for now, let's keep going.
I could keep going, but do you see my point? Those occurrences were all taken as messages by large numbers of people at some point. Their existence has been explained, however, by natural forces. Now that I've answered that question, will Turek get rid of the argument from DNA, as he calls it? I hope so, because it's awful.
And we've already addressed the problem with this way of arguing. Not only is this a bad way to argue, but it also ignores the fact that DNA quite literally does give messages and instructions for building an organism. Another problem is that his conflation of messages with the perception of messages makes his position a lot more confusing. Given the three examples that he used, which only demonstrated the perception of messages, and then seemingly arguing or implying from those that therefore DNA does not actually contain messages, that approach actually muddles the relevant distinctions between messages and perceived messages. If we ignored the difference between them, then that would make it impossible to ever believe that anything or anyone is really communicating an intentional message. If we really aren't able to tell the difference between a real and illusory message because we've been wrong about things in the past, then we wouldn't be able to tell when a message is actually being communicated or not. But if there really is a way to tell the difference, then we need to know what criteria we can use to know if a message is intentional or not. And this is what intelligent design theorists do when they attempt to add the criterion of specified complexity into their hypothesis. Now, when I talk about this, I mean this in principle or as a way to come to know things. So that's what's relevant. So what I'm talking about is a methodology that can be used for everything, and that's how we come to make really informed decisions. This isn't strictly about God, but even if we do apply this strictly to God, if God stamped every DNA strand with "made by God" or wrote, "Hey, I made everything" in the stars, we would never be able to know if this is a message from God or not, which would make it impossible for God to communicate any message to us that we would accept. Now, if you want to dig deeper into understanding more about the intelligent design position, I've put some links to my friend Jonathan McClatchy's work, as his doctorate work is in biology and ID's kind of his thing. And the rest of his video, in my opinion, only gets far, far worse. But we'll have to wait till next time to discuss it. Next time we'll get to our final and, in my opinion, the most fun episode of this short series. So subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss it, because I have a feeling that part 3 is going to get interesting. And the next time you're a genetically modified skeptic saying,
if I gave an example of a perceived message existing but then being shown to be caused by natural forces, would that satisfy this question? It would, right?
what are you going to say?
What do you mean?